My father knocked on my door 30 years after his death. I never believed in ghosts until October 15th, 2024. That was the night my father came back from the dead to reveal the truth about his murder. My name is Susan Walsh, and I'm 65 years old. I live alone in the same two-story colonial house in Dayton, Ohio, where I grew up. This is the house where my father died 30 years ago, and where I've spent every day since, wondering if I could have saved him. Dad was Robert Walsh, a good man who worked the night shift at the General Motors assembly plant for 28 years. He raised me alone after Mom died of cancer when I was 16. We were a team, just the two of us, until I got married at 22 and moved to Cincinnati with my ex-husband, David. Growing up without Mom wasn't easy, but Dad made up for it with double the love. He taught me how to change oil in a car, helped with my math homework, and sat with me all night when I had the flu. On weekends, we'd go fishing at Indian Lake, and Dad would tell stories about his childhood during the Great Depression. He always told me that the most important things in life were family and honesty, and asked me to remember that. When I turned 18, Dad insisted I go to college. He never studied beyond high school himself, but he dreamed of me getting an education. I became a nurse and worked at Miami Valley Hospital. Dad was prouder of me than anything in the world, bragging to his coworkers that his daughter saved lives. My marriage to David lasted 13 years. He was a good man, but we turned out to be too different. David wanted to move to California and start a new life, but I couldn't leave Dad alone in Ohio. Our relationship slowly crumbled due to constant arguments about the future. When we divorced in 1993, Dad met me at the front door and said my room was exactly the way I'd left it. That's when I met Dolores. Dad had been alone for 6 years after Mom's death, working double shifts and coming home to an empty house. I called him every Sunday at 7 in the evening, visited once a month when I could get away from Cincinnati. But I felt like a terrible daughter for leaving him alone. So when he told me in August 1993 that he'd met someone at the Kroger grocery store, I was thrilled. Dad told me her name was Dolores, and there were notes in his voice I hadn't heard in years. He said she was Mexican, a very kind woman who cooked amazing food. Dolores Martinez was 40 years old to Dad's 55. She was a short, plump woman with thick black hair pulled back in a neat bun. She had brown eyes, bright red lipstick, and a laugh that filled our house for the first time in years. She wore colorful dresses and smelled of vanilla and cinnamon. At our first meeting, Dolores made us enchiladas and told stories about her childhood in Texas. She was a widow. Her first husband had died in a car accident 5 years earlier. They had no children. Her parents were dead, so she moved to Ohio to live with a cousin and look for a new life. In the kitchen, while Dad watched baseball in the living room, she told me that my father was a true gentleman. She added that there weren't many men like that anymore, and he deserved happiness after everything he'd been through. I agreed. Dad really did deserve happiness. The following months were magical. Dolores transformed our house. She hung bright Mexican fabrics on the walls, put ceramic pots with cacti on the windowsills, and planted chili peppers and tomatoes in the garden. The kitchen always smelled of something delicious: tamales, fajitas, fresh baked bread. But most importantly, Dad became happy again. He lost 10 pounds, smiled more often, and bought new shirts. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch holding hands. and Dolores would sing him Mexican songs. When I visited, Dad glowed with happiness. Dad told me that Dolores took care of him like my mother had. She made sure he took vitamins, didn't drink too much beer, and went to bed early. He thought my mother had sent her to him from heaven. They got married on February 14th, 1994, on Valentine's Day. The ceremony took place at the small Catholic church of St. Anthony, where my parents had been married 30 years earlier. I was the maid of honor and cried tears of joy watching Dad truly smile again. He wore a new navy blue suit, and Dolores wore a cream lace dress that came to her knees. After the church, we had a small reception at the house. Dad's coworkers from the plant came, neighbors, and several of Dolores's friends from the Mexican community. I gave a toast wishing Dad and Dolores a long and happy life together. How wrong I was. Dolores officially moved into our house after the wedding, though she'd practically been living there for 6 months. She brought 2 suitcases of clothes and a box of family photos. Dolores said she'd never had a real home before, but now she was finally home. The first months of marriage were perfect. Dolores decorated the house in Mexican style, but kept Mom's photos and Dad's fishing trophies. She cooked his favorite dishes, washed his work clothes, and packed lunches for his night shifts. On weekends, they'd go to the casino in Indiana or watch baseball on TV. But by summer, I started noticing changes. At first, they were small things. Dad began looking tired even after weekends. His always tanned face took on a grayish tint. When I hugged him, I could feel that he'd lost weight, even though Dolores constantly cooked his favorite food. I suggested he see a doctor, but Dad brushed it off, saying things were just tough at the plant. They were laying people off. He had to work for 2. Things would get better soon. Dolores nodded, pouring this coffee. She explained that she watched his health better than he did himself. She bought special vitamins, made energy smoothies. Robert was just overworked. By fall, Dad looked even worse. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. His hands sometimes shook when he lifted his coffee cup. Several times, I caught him holding onto the wall, as if he was dizzy. I told Dad straight out that he was scaring me. Something was wrong. Maybe it was his heart or blood pressure. Dad replied that Dolores had already scheduled him with Dr. Peterson for the following week. Dr. Peterson had been treating our family for 20 years. He examined Dad, ran tests, and said it was just ordinary exhaustion. He prescribed rest, vitamins, and advised taking some time off. The doctor explained that at Dad's age, the body doesn't recover as quickly. Plus, there was stress at work. He advised taking the vitamins his wife was giving him, getting more sleep, and everything would pass. But nothing got better. On the contrary, it got worse. By winter, Dad began complaining of constant headaches. He said sometimes he saw double, and his ears rang. I insisted on another doctor visit, but Dolores said she was already giving him all the necessary medicines. She reminded me that she was a nurse and knew how to treat such things. Robert was taking special vitamins for his heart, drinking herbal teas. It just needed time. In February 1994, a year after meeting Dolores, Dad looked like a shadow of himself. He'd lost 30 pounds. His skin had become waxy. His hair had thinned. Coworkers from the plant asked me if he had cancer. I suggested to Dolores that we see another doctor. The hospital where I worked had excellent specialists. She frowned and said Dr. Peterson had known Robert for many years. Why did we need another doctor? Robert was just having a hard time adjusting to changes in life. Marriage, new responsibilities, It was stress. The last time I saw Dad alive was March 5th, 1994. I came for dinner on Sunday, as I did every week. Dad sat in his favorite chair, watched basketball, and barely touched the food Dolores brought him. He looked terrible, pale, emaciated, with sunken eyes. When Dolores went to the kitchen to wash dishes, I told Dad I was seriously worried. He looked very bad. I suggested going to the hospital tomorrow for a complete examination. Dad looked at me with a strange expression. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, then shook his head. He said he was fine, just tired. Dolores was taking good care of him. But there was something in his eyes. Fear? Doubt? I couldn't understand what. When I was getting ready to leave, Dad hugged me tightly goodbye. Usually his hugs were strong, bear-like. That time he seemed fragile, like a bird. He whispered in my ear that he loved me, asked me to remember that. Whatever happened, to remember that Dad loved me. Those were his last words. On March 9th, 1994, Thursday, I was working the night shift at the hospital. At 5:15 a.m., a nurse said I was urgently needed at the phone. I picked up and heard Dolores sobbing. She was crying and asking me to come quickly. Something had happened to my dad. He wouldn't wake up. I dropped everything and rushed home. The drive from the hospital to the house usually took 20 minutes. I made it in 12. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid I'd lose consciousness while driving. An ambulance was already at the house. The paramedics were coming out empty-handed, a bad sign. Dolores met me on the porch, hugged me and held me close. She whispered through tears that she'd found him in the morning. Wanted to wake him for breakfast, but he wasn't breathing. Called the ambulance, but it was too late. I went up to my parents' bedroom. Dad lay in bed peacefully, as if asleep. His face was calm, without traces of pain or suffering. His hands were folded on his chest. He looked as if he was just tired and decided to take a nap. Dr. Peterson was already in the house. He examined Dad, checked his pulse, shined a flashlight in his eyes. Then he shook his head and closed Dad's eyelids. He said quietly that it was heart failure. Happened in his sleep. Robert didn't suffer. I objected that Dad was relatively young, only 55 years old. Dr. Peterson sighed and explained that he'd been observing my father for the past few months. He'd weakened significantly, complained of fatigue and headaches. His heart was overloaded with stress. Unfortunately, these things happen. There was no autopsy. Dr. Peterson had known Dad for 30 years and had seen his decline over recent months. The death looked natural, so he wrote the certificate, heart failure, natural causes. I was too hurt to question the diagnosis. I just wanted to bury Dad with dignity. The funeral was held March 12th at St. Anthony's Church. Half the plant came to see Dad off. He was popular among his coworkers. Everyone said what a good man he was, how young he still was, what a shame he didn't live to see retirement. I stood next to Dolores by the coffin, and we cried together. She wore a black dress and black veil, looked like a grief-stricken widow. She held my hand and whispered that he'd been such a good husband. She'd miss him her whole life. After the funeral, it turned out Dad had a $200,000 life insurance policy through the plant. Dolores was the sole beneficiary. He'd changed the policy after the wedding. The house was also left to her in a will Dad had made in February. I didn't object to the inheritance. Dolores was his wife. They'd lived together for a year. She'd taken care of him. Besides, I was too hurt to think about money. But a month after the funeral, Dolores announced she was selling the house. She explained there were too many memories. Every corner reminded her of Robert. She couldn't stay there. She found buyers quickly, a young couple with 2 children, sold the house for $120,000, which was a fair price. She said she was moving to Florida to live with distant relatives. Dolores explained that it was warmer there, better for her health. She'd start a new life. We exchanged Christmas cards for the first 3 years. Dolores wrote that she was living in Miami, working in a nursing home, feeling well. Then the cards stopped, and I lost contact with her. I stayed in Cincinnati, worked at the hospital, tried to build a new life. I dated several men, but nothing serious worked out. I constantly thought about Dad, blamed myself for not making him see another doctor. These thoughts haunted me for years. If I'd visited more often, if I'd insisted on a complete examination, if I'd been a better daughter. In 2004, learned that the house where I grew up was for sale again. The family that bought it from Dolores was moving to another state. I hadn't planned to buy it, but when I went just to look, my heart clenched. Everything looked different. The new owners had repainted the walls, changed the floors, removed Mom's garden. But the house remained the home of my childhood, the place where Dad taught me to ride a bicycle, where we baked cookies together at Christmas, where he read me bedtime stories. I bought the house and spent 2 years restoring it. I returned the walls to their original color, restored Mom's garden, put Dad's fishing chair in the living room, as if I was trying to recreate happy memories. Neighbors wondered why I needed such a big house. I had no husband and children. I could have bought a smaller apartment. But I couldn't explain to them that the house was the only place where I felt connected to my parents. For the next 20 years, I lived there alone, worked at the hospital until retirement in 2019, tended the garden, read books, watched TV in Dad's chair. The quiet, measured life of an elderly single woman. But every night before bed, I thought about Dad, about how he looked in his final months, about the strange fear in his eyes that last evening, about his last words, about how whatever happened, I should remember that Dad loved me. Why did he say it that way? What was he sensing? These questions tormented me for 30 years, until that night when Dad decided to give me answers. October 15th, 2024. I was watching the evening news in the living room as usual. It was a quiet autumn night outside, no wind, no rustling leaves. At exactly 11:45, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. A knock at the front door. Not an ordinary knock, a special rhythm that only I knew. 3 short knocks. Pause. 2 long ones. Exactly how Dad used to knock when coming home from the night shift, so as not to wake us with a loud doorbell. My heart stopped. I froze on the couch, staring at the door. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was wind rattling the shutters. The knock repeated. Knock, knock, knock. Pause. Knock, knock. The same rhythm, the same force. As if Dad was standing on the porch with his lunch bucket, waiting for me to open the door. I stood on shaking legs and approached the door. I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. Only the yellow porch light illuminated the fallen maple leaves. No cars on the street. No people. I opened the door and looked outside. Cold October air hit my face, but no one was visible. The neighbors' houses were sleeping. Windows dark. Even the dogs weren't barking. I said aloud that it was probably the wind, but my voice trembled. It was an absolutely quiet night, without the slightest breeze. I closed the door and returned to the TV, but couldn't concentrate on the news. The knock was too real, too familiar. That's exactly how Dad's knock sounded 30 years ago. The next night, I prepared in advance. I sat in the living room with the lights on, watched the door, and waited. At 11:45, the knock repeated. The same rhythm, the same intensity. I ran to the door and immediately threw it open. The porch was empty. On the third night, I stood by the window and watched the porch through a slightly opened curtain. At 11:45, the familiar knock sounded, but there was no one on the porch. The sound clearly came from the door, but there was no one to knock. On the fourth night, I decided to open the door immediately. When Dad's knock sounded, I rushed to the door and threw it open without looking through the peephole. The porch was empty, but an old brass key lay on the doorstep. I picked it up with trembling hands. It was the basement key, the same one Dad always carried on his keychain with his work keys. I remembered it from childhood. Brass, darkened with age, with characteristic notches. The key was warm, as if someone had just been holding it. I hadn't gone down to the basement in years. After Dad's death, Dolores turned it into a storage room for canned goods and old clothes. The new owners of the house used the basement for storing furniture. When I bought back the house in 2004, I simply locked the basement door and forgot about it. Now the key seemed to burn my palm. Dad wanted me to go downstairs. I took a flashlight and opened the basement door. The wooden steps creaked under my feet, the same sounds as in childhood. I turned on the dusty light bulb, and the basement was illuminated with dim yellow light. It looked exactly the same as 30 years ago. Concrete walls painted white, an old water heater in the corner, Dad's workbench against the far wall with tools no one had touched for decades. Even the smell was the same: dampness, old wood, machine oil. But in the opposite corner stood cardboard boxes I didn't remember. 3 large banana boxes with Chiquita written on them. Dad often brought such boxes from the plant, sturdy, convenient for storage. Each box had my name written on it, for Susie. In the first box were Dad's work things: a yellow plastic hard hat with a Union sticker, thick leather gloves that smelled of machine oil, a metal thermos he drank coffee from during night shifts, a 25 years of service pin from General Motors. The second box contained family photographs: my parents' wedding, my high school graduation photo, Dad with coworkers at a plant picnic, me in a white nurse's dress after college graduation, hundreds of photos of our happy family life before Dolores arrived. The third box was the heaviest. When I opened it, I saw folders of documents, neatly stacked and labeled in his handwriting. The first folder was labeled Medical Records, February 1994. Inside were the results of a complete medical examination Dad had undergone at Miami Valley Clinic on February 15th, 1994, just 3 weeks before his death. An examination I knew nothing about. Blood tests showed everything normal. EKG, healthy heart, regular rhythm. Chest X-ray, clear lungs. Urine analysis, no abnormalities. The doctor wrote in the conclusion that the patient was in excellent condition for his age. All indicators were within normal limits. Cardiovascular system functioning normally. This was 3 weeks before his death from heart failure. In the corner of the first page was Dad's pencil note: if something happens, show Susie. She'll understand. My hands trembled as I opened the second folder, financial documents. Inside were bank statements for the last 6 months of Dad's life. I studied them under the light bulb, and the picture became increasingly frightening. In September 1993, a large check for $10,000 was withdrawn from Dad's checking account. Recipient, Dolores Martinez. The payment purpose was written as medical expenses. But what medical expenses? Dad wasn't hospitalized, didn't undergo expensive procedures. Dr. Peterson charged $50 for a visit. In October, another check for $8,000. In November, $5,000. In December, $7,000. By February 1994, Dolores had received $38,000 from Dad, allegedly for medical expenses and family needs. Dad was never wasteful. He saved every dollar, dreaming of a decent retirement. Where did such expenses come from? The third folder was labeled Evidence. Inside were 3 empty pill bottles without labels. White crumbs remained at the bottom of one. A note in Dad's handwriting was attached to the bottles. Dolores gives me these pills every day, says they're vitamins, but I feel worse after taking them. I hide some pills instead of swallowing them. Next to the bottles lay an envelope with my name written in shaky handwriting. I opened it and unfolded a sheet of paper. Date, March 5th, 1994. 4 days before Dad's death. In the letter, Dad wrote that if I was reading this, something had happened to him. He didn't want to scare me, but he had to write the truth. Dolores wasn't who she seemed. At first, everything was good, but in recent months, he'd started noticing strange things. She gave him pills she called vitamins. After taking them, he felt very bad. Dizzy, nauseous, his heart beat irregularly. He tried not to take them, said he'd already taken them, but she watched him, counted the pills in the bottle. When he refused, she'd cry and say he didn't trust her care. Dad wrote that he thought she was poisoning him. He knew it sounded crazy, but he felt like he was dying. Every day got worse. He'd secretly undergone an examination at the clinic. Doctors said he was healthy, so it wasn't age or fatigue. Dolores had taken $38,000 from him. She said the money was needed for his treatment, but there was no treatment, only these damned pills. He tried to talk to Dr. Peterson, but Dolores was always present during conversations. She was very smart, knew what to say. Dad asked me if something happened to him to check the bank accounts, check these pills, and most importantly, not to blame myself. I was the best daughter a father could dream of. He'd hidden all the evidence in the basement, in an old coffee can behind the water heater. There were a few more pills there that he hadn't swallowed. Maybe doctors could determine what they were. Dad wrote that he was scared he wouldn't live to see me read this letter. But if the worst happened, I had to find the truth. Dolores shouldn't kill people with impunity. He thought he wasn't the first. Yesterday, she'd mentioned her second husband, whom she'd also lost to heart problems. Before, she'd said she'd only been married once. Dad asked me to take care of myself, not to let her near me after his death. She was dangerous. He loved me more than life. A letter trembled in my hands. All these years I'd blamed myself for Dad's death, and he'd been trying to warn me. He knew he was being murdered and was collecting evidence. I rushed to the water heater. Behind it, on a metal shelf, stood an old Folgers coffee can. Dad used such cans to store nails and bolts in his workshop. Inside the can were 4 more white pills and a small notebook. On the cover, in Dad's handwriting, was written, "Poisoning Diary." I'd opened the notebook. Dad had kept detailed records. September 15th, 1993. Dolores gave new vitamins, large white pills. After taking them, I feel dizzy, weak. September 20th. Pills every day. It's become harder to climb stairs. My hands shake. October 5th. Tried not to take the pill. Said I forgot. Dolores got upset, cried, said she wanted to help my health. Had to take it. October 12th. Vision deteriorating. Sometimes I see double. I hear ringing in my ears. November 3rd. Dr. Peterson says it's age, but Dolores won't let me talk to him alone. She's always nearby. November 20th. Started hiding pills. I pretend to swallow, then spit them out. Feel better the next day. December 10th. Dolores noticed I became more energetic. Now she watches to make sure I actually swallow the pill. Stands nearby until I wash it down with water. January 2nd, 1994. Losing weight very quickly. Coworkers ask if I have cancer. If they only knew the truth. February 15th. Had a secret examination. Doctors say I'm healthy. So it's the pills. March 1st. Dolores demands I change my will. Says a wife should inherit everything. If I refuse, she'll cry and say I don't love her. March 5th. Last entry. Hiding the diary and all evidence. If something happens, Susie will find the truth. The last entry was made 4 days before Dad's death. I sat on the basement floor among Dad's documents and cried. Not from grief, from rage. Dolores had slowly murdered my father, and I thought he'd died naturally. She'd extorted money from him, forced him to change his will, then increased the poison dose to speed up his death. And I'd blamed myself for 30 years. But now I had evidence. Medical certificates showing Dad was healthy. Bank statements with suspicious transfers. A diary with detailed descriptions of poisoning. And most importantly, pills that could be analyzed. The next morning, I went to the Dayton police. The duty officer listened to my story with sympathy but skepticism. 30 years had passed. The main suspect lived in another state. The death certificate indicated natural causes. He wanted to take my statement and pass it to detectives when they were free. But when I took out Dad's documents and spread them on the table, his attitude changed. The officer told me to wait and disappeared into the depths of the station. 10 minutes later, he returned with a detective. A man about 50, with gray hair and tired eyes. The detective introduced himself as Michael Connor and asked me to tell him everything from the beginning. I repeated the whole story, showed the medical certificates, bank statements, Dad's diary, and the pills. Detective Connor carefully studied the documents, made notes in his notebook. He finally said these were very serious accusations. If my stepmother really poisoned my father, we were talking about first-degree murder. But 30 years had passed. He explained what complications this created. I said I understood, but asked if nothing could be done. Detective Connor looked at the pills in the plastic bag. He explained that these pills could be analyzed. If poison was found, it would be serious evidence. But for a full investigation, we'd need to exhume my father's body. The thought of Dad being dug up from his grave was horrible. But the thought of his killer living on his money for 30 years was even worse. I said, firmly, to do it. The pill analysis took a week. The result confirmed my worst suspicions. The white pills contained high concentrations of digitalis, an extract from foxglove. Detective Connor explained that this was a plant poison. In small doses, it's used as heart medicine. It's called digoxin. But in large doses, it's deadly. The most insidious thing, it accumulates in the body gradually. First, it causes weakness, dizziness, nausea. Then it disrupts heart rhythm and eventually stops the heart. I said this explained why Dad felt worse and worse. The detective agreed. My stepmother gave him digitalis disguised as vitamins. Very clever. Most doctors wouldn't think of poisoning when they see symptoms of heart failure in a 55-year-old man. The exhumation was scheduled for November 15th, 2024, exactly 1 month after the first nighttime knock. I didn't attend the exhumation. Couldn't bear the thought of Dad's body being removed from the ground. Instead, I waited at home, drank tea, and prayed that the tests would confirm my suspicions. Modern technology allows detection of poison traces even after decades. The results came 2 weeks later. Extremely high concentrations of digitalis were found in Dad's tissues, tens of times higher than therapeutic doses. The forensic expert concluded that death resulted from acute digitalis poisoning, causing cardiac arrest. Detective Connor explained that someone had been giving my father this poison regularly for several months. The last dose was lethal. This wasn't an accident, but premeditated murder. Now we had to find Dolores. She lived in Florida under her maiden name Martinez. Detective Connor contacted Miami police and asked them to check her background. What they discovered exceeded my worst expectations. Dolores Martinez hadn't been married once or twice. She'd been married 5 times over the past 40 years. All her husbands died of heart failure between the ages of 40 and 55. All left her large insurance policies. First husband, Jose Rodriguez, died in 1985 in Texas, $50,000 policy. Second husband, David Smith, died in 1989 in Arizona, $75,000 policy. Third husband, my dad, Robert Walsh, died in 1994 in Ohio, $200,000 policy. Fourth husband, Richard Thompson, died in 2001 in Florida, $125,000 policy. Fifth husband, Alberto Vasquez, died in 2010 in Florida, $150,000 policy. Total insurance money, $600,000 over 40 years of widowhood. Detective Connor told me my stepmother was a serial killer. She specialized in middle-aged men with good insurance policies and minimal family connections. I asked why no one had stopped her earlier. He explained that she was very smart. She chose victims in different states, changed names, used different methods of meeting people. Digitalis causes natural death, so doctors rarely suspect poisoning. And most importantly, she waited several years between murders. Miami police began surveillance of Dolores. It turned out that at 71, she'd married again. Her new husband was Frank Morelli, a 70-year-old widower with a pension and $300,000 in life insurance. Detective Connor said we needed to act quickly. If she followed her usual pattern, Mr. Morelli was already in danger. The arrest happened December 15th, 2024, exactly 2 months after the first nighttime knock from Dad. Miami police found Dolores in a small apartment in Coral Gables. She lived there with her husband Frank, who, according to neighbors, had looked very ill recently and complained of weakness. During the apartment search, they found a whole pharmacy of poisons. Digitalis in various forms, pills, liquid extract, dried foxglove leaves, a notebook with victims' names, dates, and dosages. Dad was recorded as Robert, March 1994. 2 drops of digitalis in morning coffee, 1 pill at dinner with vitamins. Next to Dad's entry was a new one. Frank, started November 2024. 1 drop daily, increased dose by Christmas. Dolores was planning to kill her new husband by New Year's. At her arrest, she looked like an ordinary, elderly Latina woman. Gray hair, kind brown eyes, a grandmother's soft face. It was hard to believe this woman had cold-bloodedly murdered 5 men. But when they read her the charges, the mask of kindness fell away. Dolores looked at the police with cold, calculating killer's eyes. The trial began in March 2025. I attended every session, sat in the front row, and looked at the woman who killed my father. The prosecutor presented convincing evidence. Medical records of all 5 husbands showed the same pattern. Healthy men suddenly became ill, quickly weakened, and died of heart failure within months. All insurance policies were made out to Dolores shortly before the husband's deaths. Dolores's notebook contained detailed instructions for digitalis dosing. How to start with small doses, how to increase gradually, how to disguise poison as vitamins and medicine. The most frightening evidence was a letter found in Dolores's apartment. She wrote to her sister in Mexico about American men being very trusting. They're willing to marry a woman who cooks well and takes care of them. And insurance policies here are large. You can live comfortably. At trial, Dolores showed no remorse. She confessed to all the murders, but claimed she was helping men die without suffering. She said they were lonely and unhappy. She gave them their last months of happiness, then a peaceful death. Digitalis doesn't cause pain. They fell asleep and didn't wake up. When the judge asked about motives, Dolores shrugged and said she needed money. In Mexico, she was poor. Here in America, there were opportunities. The prosecutor asked about love for these men. Dolores smirked and replied that love was an illusion. She was a good actress. She cooked, cleaned, played the caring wife. Men wanted to be loved. She gave them that illusion. Dad was an exception to her plans. He turned out to be suspicious and started collecting evidence, so Dolores had to kill him faster than planned. She said at trial that Robert was smart. He understood what was happening. She had to increase the dose. Too bad. He was a good man. Too bad. She spoke of Dad's death as if she regretted a broken toy. The judge sentenced Dolores to 5 life terms without possibility of parole. At 71, she'll sit in prison until she dies. The families of other victims received compensation from Dolores' savings. Over 40 years of murders, she'd accumulated almost $1 million, insurance money, sold houses, husbands' bank accounts. All this money was divided among the children and grandchildren of her victims. Frank Morelli survived. When Dolores was arrested, doctors found traces of digitalis in his blood, but the concentration wasn't yet lethal. A few weeks of treatment, and he fully recovered. Detective Connor told me that another week or 2, and Mr. Morelli would have died. My father saved a stranger's life by helping find the truth. On the night after the verdict, I sat at home and waited for the familiar knock at the door. 11:45 came and went. There was no knock. The house was silent. I sat until morning, but Dad didn't come anymore. He'd gotten his justice and finally found peace. 6 months have passed since the trial. There are no more knocks. But sometimes, especially in the evenings, I feel Dad's presence. Not frightening like that October, but warm, protective, as if he's still taking care of me, only now with a peaceful soul. I don't blame myself for his death anymore. Dad was a smart, observant man. He understood that Dolores was killing him and left me all the necessary evidence. He believed that sooner or later I'd find the truth. He believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. Recently, I reread his last letter. At the very end, he wrote that I shouldn't blame myself. I was the best daughter a father could dream of. He was proud of me and loved me more than life. He wrote those words 4 days before his death, knowing he was being murdered, but thinking of me, about me not suffering, about me not blaming myself. Now I understand. Love really is stronger than death. Dad didn't come back as a ghost. He came back as a protector, as a father who couldn't rest while his daughter was in trouble. He led me to the truth and protected me from the guilt that had tormented me for 30 years. Dolores Martinez is now 82 years old. She'll die in prison, and that's justice. 5 good men died because of her greed. 5 families, like mine, blamed themselves for years for the deaths of their loved ones. But now we all know the truth. Detective Connor told me that Dolores's case helped police in other states solve similar crimes. It turned out there are more serial killers specializing as black widows than people think. They choose lonely men, play loving wives, and slowly kill their husbands for insurance money. Detective Connor said my father didn't just save Mr. Morelli, but helped police understand how such criminals work. Now they know what to look for. Sometimes in the evenings, I sit in Dad's old chair and tell him about my day, about how our neighborhood has changed, about the neighbor children playing in the yard, about new flowers in Mom's garden. He doesn't answer in words, but I feel his presence, loving, calm, content. In the basement, I found another note I hadn't noticed the first time. It lay at the very bottom of the box with photographs, written in shaky handwriting. In the note, Dad wrote that if I was reading this, I'd found all his records. He knew how much it hurt me. He knew I'd blame myself, but he asked me not to. He wrote that I'd become an amazing woman, smart, kind, strong. He was proud of how I'd grown up, proud that I became a nurse and helped people, proud that I had a good heart and an honest soul. Dad asked me not to let anyone tell me I wasn't good enough, not to let anyone make me feel guilty about his death. It wasn't my fault. An evil person chose evil, and I was his light, his joy, the meaning of his life. Even while dying, he thought about how happy he was to have had such a daughter. Dad asked me to live a full life, to be happy. That's all a father wants. He wrote that he'd always be nearby, even if I couldn't see him. His love for me was stronger than death. I keep this note in my wallet. I reread it every time I start doubting myself. Dad's voice reminds me that I'm loved, that I deserve happiness, that I was and remain his pride. The knocking stopped, but Dad's presence remained, not as a ghost, but as a blessing, as a reminder that true love survives even death, and that justice, even 30 years late, always prevails. Now that it's all over, I understand. Dad didn't just come back to reveal the truth about his murder. He came back to free me from the guilt that was destroying my life. He came back to say he loved me and was proud of me. And most importantly, he came back to remind me that love between a father and daughter really is stronger than death. Detective Connor sometimes calls me to tell me about new cases they've been able to solve thanks to Dad's evidence. In Nevada, they found a woman who poisoned 3 husbands the same way. In Texas, they arrested a man who killed elderly women by posing as a caring caregiver. Dad's evidence helped create a database of suspicious deaths across the country. Now, when a lonely middle-aged person dies of heart failure shortly after marriage, police check the new spouse's history. This is Dad's legacy. Not just justice for himself, but protection for other innocent people. I decided to sell the house and move closer to the children's hospital where I want to volunteer. The house fulfilled its purpose. It helped me find the truth and find peace. Now it's time to start a new chapter of life. When the real estate agent asked about the house's history, I told only the good parts. About how a happy family lived here, how a father taught his daughter to ride a bicycle in the garden, how they fished together and baked cookies at Christmas, about the love that filled these walls for 30 years. The new owners are a young couple with a little daughter. When I handed them the keys, the girl asked if there were ghosts in the house. I smiled and said yes, there were, but it was a good ghost. The spirit of a father who loved his family very much. He would protect everyone who lived in this house. The parents laughed, thinking I was joking, but the girl nodded seriously, as if she understood. Children often understand things that are beyond adults. On the last night before moving, I sat in Dad's chair and looked at the empty walls. The house seemed different without furniture and pictures, but the atmosphere of love remained. At 11:45, I heard a familiar sound. Not a knock at the door, but quiet footsteps on the stairs. The same footsteps Dad used to make, going upstairs to bed after his night shift, trying not to wake us. I wasn't scared. I closed my eyes and felt Dad sit in his chair next to me. I felt the warmth of his presence, the smell of machine oil and old spice that he'd used his whole life. We sat together in silence, father and daughter, finally reunited in understanding and love. Then I felt him lean over and kiss my forehead, like he did when I was little, and I whispered softly, "Thank you, Dad, for everything." The footsteps moved away up the stairs, and the house became empty again. But the emptiness was different. Not lonely, but peaceful. Dad had said goodbye and let me go live my life. I stood up, took the last box, and left the house without looking back. A new life was waiting for me. A life without guilt and fears. A life blessed by a father's love that really is stronger than death.